All right, there we are. We're just at 4:30. We'll give it another minute. Thank you all for coming on this crisp fall day here in Philadelphia. All right, it's a quick half hour, so let's go ahead and jump right in. I am Vanessa Lowe, your host for Financing Philadelphia's Future. Excited today to have our latest guest, Marco Rosea Rossi. Let's go through some of the sort of standards, how to watch us best. There we go. Use the speaker view using that icon at the top right of your screen. That's the best way to watch. We want your questions, so please put them in the chat, letting us know which section of the city you're from, Mount Airy, Center City, et cetera, et cetera. And if you want to join us and get more notices about what all we're doing, enter your email in the chat with your name. All right. So today, again, we have our guest, Marco Rosea Rossi. Before I introduce him in detail, though, we want to turn to Peter Winslow, who's going to give us a brief update on the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition. Peter?
Thanks, Vanessa. I just have a couple of announcements that I think will be of interest to the people who are here with us today and the people who pick up this conversation through the YouTube channel and elsewhere. First, there is the proceedings of the 21st American Monetary Institute conference on monetary reform, which took place last month, is available, and I will put the link to those resources in the chat. It's quite interesting. It's a lot of materials there. The second item that I want to bring to people's attention is that a conference on public banking for community development is being held next week at Harvard Law School. The Public Banking Institute and the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition will be represented there. There's some current events locally, or not, some current events and some near future events happening locally. People should be alerted that we're anticipating that the City Council will be holding a hearing on Councilmember Young's Resolution 250455 to receive a report from the administration on progress in establishing the Philadelphia Public Financial Authority and the public bank. The date for that is yet to be determined. Between now and then, there's going to be a lot of activity on the part of folks in the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition to prepare for it. Also, there is a progress being made on the pension proposal, a right to know relative to the equities that are currently being pursued by the Philadelphia Board of Pensions and Retirement is in progress. We have reaching out and have new avenues to connect with the controller and with the municipal labor unions. This proposal and economically targeted investments are also part of the affordability agenda, which is being put forth in the city. The final item that I want to bring to folks' attention is that the Sohav Mandami campaign in New York has published a paper on democratic public finance, which it could be seminal for the public banking movement and a point of intellectual pivot and a paradigm shift. So I'm putting that document into the chat for people's reference. Those are my announcements. Back to you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Peter. All right, so Marco Rosea Rossi is the executive director of Washingtonians for Public Banking, WPB. So this is really exciting because it sounds like we've been doing similar things. And he has a whole presentation. The Washingtonians for Public Banking organizes, educates, and advocates for the establishment of public banking in Washington State. They prioritize economic equity, sustainability, and an affordable green economy for Washingtonians over the profits of private financial institutions. All right, let's go ahead and turn it over to Marco. Welcome, Marco. We're so glad you could join us.
I'm very happy to be here. As mentioned, I did prepare a few slides to help everyone understand the organization I work for and the projects we're undertaking and how they are similar to what you're trying to accomplish in Philadelphia. At the end of the presentation, I will put our website and email if anyone wants to contact me. I learn a lot by talking to other groups throughout the country, so I'm really hoping to continue this conversation going. As mentioned in the introduction, I work for an organization called Washingtonians for Public Banking. We're a small, scrappy organization. We've only been around for about 3 years. And like I said, we're just getting started. I only work for it part-time, but our mission is to promote public banking throughout the state of Washington. Now, ever since 2009, there has been legislation introduced in the Washington State Legislature to promote public banking. There was various groups who were interested in this and a few key visionary state legislators who introduced these bills time and time again. They didn't see much traction. And it was thought that, if we're really going to get this mission accomplished, we need to establish an organization that is dedicated to fighting this cause 24/7. And that's why Washingtonians for Public Banking was established. As you can see, this is a list of all legislation that has been introduced in our Washington State Legislature to establish a state-level public bank, somewhat akin to what they have in North Dakota, which is the model that a lot of the people in public banking movement turn to. In 2021-22 legislative session, we did get it past the Senate. How that was a very weak bill. Even some of the supporters weren't too enthusiastic because it was very watered down. This most recent legislative session, when we had SB 5754, we do consider that we were able to make progress. We had a much stronger bill, and we did get it out of the Senate Financial Services Business and Trade Committee. But right now it's stuck in Ways and Means. So we're talking to our supporters to try to push that legislation forward in the next legislative session. But in the meantime, we are working on some other projects to get public banking done on a more local level, and that's why we see our cause really similar to what's happened in Philadelphia. So with trying to establish public banking in Washington State, there are some constitutional issues. Washington State has a provision in its constitution referred to as the prohibition of gift of public funds, which prevents governments from directly being involved in the financial sector and lending assets to private businesses. Now, this was established into the Constitution because the Washington Constitution was written in the 1890s when the state was formed. And this was a time when there were the railroad monopolies in the Gilded Age. They kind of ran rampant, and they were really successful at convincing governments, municipalities to take out debt on their behalf for economic development. And then if the railroads didn't pan out, the government was totally saddled with the debt. So this provision in the Constitution was really trying to prevent those types of scenarios. However, it's often been used as a way to preventing any economic development whatsoever. And it seems to be some type of barrier to creating some type of banking services that we want to see in the state. There are some exceptions to these activities. One is if it's for essential government service or serves some type of governmental purpose, and that's determined by the courts. And over the years, the courts have expanded the type of activities that they consider within that realm. So it does include promoting higher education. In Washington State, we do have a right to education guaranteed in our Constitution. The courts say it does include providing government doing things to provide childcare, disaster mitigation, and then basic infrastructure. It also doesn't put any restrictions on any lending to other governments. So if we established a public bank in the state level in Washington State, it could lend out to other governments to do things. And then anything government program that you can demonstrate benefits the poor or the infirm in the state, that is exempted from this clause as well. All right. But this is really designed to protect the taxpayers. Now, unfortunately, it means that we couldn't have a public bank precisely in the same model of North Dakota, and we'd have to structure it with some nuanced provisions to be in line with our Constitution. Essentially, if the public bank operated on a state level, if it was a depository institution for the state, it could lend out on those criteria. but it couldn't lend out in any other regard, and it probably couldn't do what North Dakota does, which acts as a mini Federal Reserve for their state, um, and it supports those financial institutions. There is a possibility, because the courts have expanded what they think of certain essential government services, they could see providing those services as an essential government services. And I know a lot of people in the public banking movement make the argument that money should be treated like infrastructure, but so far we haven't had any rulings in our court to establish that. Another possibility is the state could establish some type of public bank and not has it be a depository institution from the state. So have some type of way of getting a deposit, but it wouldn't be a public funds deposit. If that was the case, then the bank would be freed up to do whatever it wanted. All right. Or there's a possibility the state could provide both institutions, create both institutions, provide two different needs for the people of the community. Now, another route we can go in Washington state is the state has allowed for these institutions called public development authorities. And these are institutions specifically designed to promote economic development through the state. Because they are designed to promote economic development and operate like a business, they're denied certain powers that are normally given to a government body. So they don't have any taxing authority, and they can't exercise eminent domain. But in exchange for giving up those authorities to be in line with our Constitution, they can run businesses like anything else. And also, according to our Constitution and court precedent, it's not a violation of the Washington Constitution for other government entities to give assets to this institution. So it is possible to create a public development authority on a county or municipal level and charter that institution as a public bank, where the chartering body would have some control over the governing board. Then they could transfer their deposits over to that institution, and that institution engage in lending with anybody in their community and operate as a normal business would. It's just that that institution would never be able to exercise any taxing authority or have the capability of eminent domain. To give kind of a breakdown on how this would work, this is a comparison between a normal government, a public development authority, and a private enterprise in Washington state. So governments can collect taxes, public development authorities and private enterprises can't. Exercise eminent domain, governments can do that, public authorities, private enterprises can't. Own property, all three institutions can own property. All three institutions can issue bonds. Receive assets and gifts from other governments. So the governments can receive government assets, and they can also give assets to public development authorities, but you can't give an asset. The government cannot give an asset to a private enterprise unless it's in line with the framework of the Constitution. Governments in Washington state can't own or operate businesses. They're restricted to that, but public development authorities can, and private businesses can. But one thing the public development authorities also can't do is they can't issue stock. So we've had to kind of think of clever ways that if we established a public bank as a public development authority, how would we capitalize it? It is possible for a local government to have some type of tax revenue and then give that revenue to the public development authority. But we have to think of some really creative ways to do this, because they couldn't issue any preferred stock to help capitalize the institution. But this is the framework that we've been looking at to get these institutions off around, where we would create a public development authority as a public bank, then find some way of raising the capital. And we're exploring a variety of options to do that. One thing that's problematic about Washington is our tax structure is really regressive. For years, we had the most regressive tax structure in the country, but the state legislature recently passed a capital gains tax, and our courts determined it was constitutional. So we moved from 50 to 49 in terms of our aggressivity in our tax structure. And then once we capitalize it, to get a bank license with our DFI, and then accept public deposits. Now, like all states, we have requirements on accepting public deposits. We have a public deposit commission. That is done on the state level. And my understanding is in Philadelphia, you have it done on the local level. We have it done on the state level. So we'd have to change certain laws, or we have to, whatever deposits we collect, we have to ensure that are collateralized in conformity with state statutes. And then we are hoping to join the Federal Home Loan Bank system, the federal credit system, as a way of increasing equity and viability of the bank, especially if the bank would be engaging in lending for housing, which is a huge need in Washington state. We have a huge chronic housing shortage, especially in our urban areas. Pierce County and King County. King County is where Seattle is. One of the ways we are investigating a capitalized institution is working with some legislative allies to create a credit facility, which we see as kind of a step toward a state level public bank. This is something Vermont has done. They had a program called 10% in Vermont. It came out of their public banking movement. They weren't able to establish a bank, but they established a credit facility, which allows the state treasurer to take 10% of the average daily balance for the deposit and restructure them into loans to invest in the state. Well, it's quite possible we could use this as a stepping stone to create a public bank, not just only getting the state to do some lending, but lend to these smaller financial authorities and then use that to purchase assets that they can then transform into capital so they're well positioned to become public banks. That way, we wouldn't have to worry about necessarily borrowing from a pension fund or raising taxes or any other means of trying to raise this revenue. All right. So in Washington, it's expected that our average daily balance in 2016 would be about $13 billion. So if that's, sorry, 2016, I meant to say 2026 would be about $13 billion. So if we did 10% of that, it'd be $1.3 billion that we could give in lending throughout the state. And this is kind of our idea. We could have the state create a credit facility, work to that credit facility to help capitalize these local public banks that we do have some cities that have shown some real interest in, both in Tacoma and Seattle, which are some of our major cities in the state. And then they could engage in lending throughout the community. Now, one major issue, as I mentioned before, is development for housing. Recently, Seattle created a social housing developer, which allows a public institution, which was organized as a PDA, to intervene in the housing market and providing housing on a not-for-profit basis as a public good. To really superpower those institutions, though, they really need to kind of get a lot of access to lending. So coupling them with a public bank is really beneficial, especially for those areas that don't have the tax base that Seattle has. Seattle is a very, very wealthy city. They have professional baseball teams. They have all these people with very, very high incomes that they can tax to help develop these projects. Not all cities in Washington have that. So having them nurtured with a public bank really is possible. They can get these projects off the ground. In Washington, creating a single unit of affordable housing is somewhere between $300,000 and $350,000. So if you really want to may have a main impact, you do need a large pool of funds to establish that. And we're hoping to use the local deposits through lending to help get those projects off the ground. All right, that kind of concludes the presentation part. I am happy to answer any questions. My understanding is for Philadelphia, you've been very successful on getting your financial authority off the ground, which for us in Washington, we'd love to see. We really think that a win for public banking anywhere is a win for public banking everywhere. And so we're really looking for you, but also the charter that you've written is something that, I've poured over. We are kind of using as a model to draft up how we'd want our own public development authorities to operate, to transition to public banks as well. So we're really happy to kind of learn from each other to see how we can both support each other's movements. I know because, laws are different from each state, there's always a unique situation, state by state, community by community, but I think there's a lot we can still learn from each other.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that presentation. Very, very helpful. So yes, the legislation passed in City Council, 15 yes, 1 no, but unfortunately our outgoing mayor refused to sign it, and our current mayor has not essentially moved forward with it, meaning appointed the board, and so that's where we're stuck. And so Peter just reported how there's going to be a city council hearing. Can you say a little bit more about what we expect from that hearing, Peter?
That's a really good question, Vanessa. I think that at the hearing, we'll have an opportunity to find out what the hesitation has been on the part of the park administration to appointing the board, and to see if there is any modifications of the legislation that would be necessary to make this acceptable and gain the enthusiasm of Mayor Parker and the administration. So part of that is that we have not been able to have an exploratory and productive discussion yet with Mayor Parker about this issue to correct some misunderstandings or misapprehensions that we think exist, and that the hearing will be an opportunity to make things clear, both from the standpoint of exactly what it is we're talking about, how the public bank is different from anything else that exists in Philadelphia, what it can do to benefit uh, the city and its inhabitants, and to explore what the concerns are of the administration.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so we'll see. Just waiting for a date on that next. So that would be good. So one of the things about our Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition is I would say one of the best things they've done is the organizing, particularly with City Council. Just lots and lots of conversations, getting Derek Green, who was our champion and brought the legislation forward, and then ran for mayor really on the success of that campaign. Unfortunately, he wasn't elected, but the organizing, I think that the coalition does is really great. Tell us about your organizing. How are you sort of speaking to both, the legislators, but also to just everyday people about this? How do y'all do that?
So we started to form relationships with some groups, the activist groups that are very interested in this. Up until recently, a lot of the interest in public banking has been at the state level. So it's been very dispersed throughout the state. But with this real focus on trying to get it off the ground on the local level, we've started some real engagement, some activist groups. There's a group in Tacoma called Tacoma for All that is really interested in creating a social housing developer for the city and coupling with public banking, mostly because they don't have the tax base that Seattle has. So they know that they no way they could fund these projects without having some type of creative financing program for it. Up in Seattle, we've also had some interest in this. At the top of the presentation, you mentioned Mandani. Well, we kind of have a parallel situation in Seattle with Katie Wilson. She's been consistently ahead in the polls in Seattle. She is a real outsider, never held any office before in her life, and she's looks like she has a good chance to become the new mayor of Seattle. I've met with her. She's expressed a lot of interest in public banking. And if she does become mayor, then that's really important because we know that this type of project, you really need you really need a lot of control over the staff and the executive branch to help shepherd it through because the regulatory process is complicated. So she has expressed interest. It's likely that if she wins, there'd be a big opening in Seattle that we could hope we can get this project off the ground there. She's mentioned that she wants to have something like this to help deal with the housing crisis in Seattle, but also the childcare crisis, which is another crisis that we see across the nation. They have a lot of people who want to start childcare facilities, like Washington, like a lot of states, you can start a child care facility in your home. So have to do some renovations and things like that. But we have some people who are interested in doing that, but they can't get the financing to get their businesses off the ground. And so this type of project would really help with that, getting those projects off the ground. So I've met with some other people who are interested in drafting some documents to kind of, if she ends up being successful, to push her administration forward to do this. We've also met with some King County legislatures. King County is the county that contains Seattle, and had conversations about this, explore this on a county level.
Cool, cool.
Vanessa, I would point out that there's a lot of interest bubbling up from municipalities around the country. At the Public Banking Institute, we've had conversations with folks in several jurisdictions in Florida, and in places in North Carolina and places around the country, including places that you wouldn't anticipate, like Iowa City. So there's a lot of local interest on the municipal level that has not been there before.
Yeah, yeah. So Peter, I'm going to tee you up for any questions that are coming in, but I want to ask the next question, which is, we had, so the response from the prior mayor was, we don't need this, there are enough CDFIs here. So the Philadelphia intention was we were always going to partner with financial institutions, but we did get a little pushback, I think, from some of the banks and maybe even some of the CDFIs. What's been the response from the rest of the banking community in Washington?
It's unfortunately, it's quite mixed. The community bankers of Washington, or the Community Bankers Association, their leadership has been pretty outspoken. They're against public banking and have testified against all the public banking bills. We have tried to reach out to them and spark a conversation, but their leadership has been pretty explicit that they are essentially ideologically opposed to this. Now, we think that's very unfortunate because, again, looking at the North Dakota model, a large public bank can actually provide a lot of support for the local community public banks. Because in North Dakota, their bank acts right as the mini Federal Reserve. Banks, more than any other institution, engages in a lot of lending. So having affordable interest rates is really critical to a bank. So we want to partner with them. And one thing that we've really put a lot of research in our organization is looking at the decline of community banks. We had in the 2000s, in the 90s and 2000s, we had over 60 community banks, or banks that were chartered by the state. Now we are down to 39. Actually, I think it may be even lower than that now. But we've just seen a decimation of our community banks. We're also doing research on where our deposits are going, because we have a public deposit system and it tracks where all the public deposit going, and the majority of that money ends up in not just private banks, not credit unions, but private banks that are the huge mega banks. Like they control the majority of our deposits. So that's another argument saying, hey, if we establish an institution, we can provide you a lifeline to kind of stop this bleeding. But unfortunately, a lot of the Community Bankers Association Washington doesn't see it that way. But we've had more success in conversations with credit unions. Recently in Washington State, there was a conference by cooperatives, and I was invited to present a presentation, talk about the relationship between credit unions and community banks, and talked to a lot of people with CDFIs, and they were really interested in this idea because they kind of saw more as like, yeah, you can help us. And one of the restrictions on credit unions is by law they're prevented from engaging in a lot of lending to businesses. It's capped. So having some other types of support structure, they're really eager to have that because they constantly have to, tailor their lending to specific requirements to be in conformity with the laws that charter them.
Exactly. We've got 3 minutes left. Peter, is there any questions in that queue?
I'd like to turn over to Stan Shapiro. He had an observation and I think a question. Stan?
Yeah, well, so my theory on the Pennsylvania provision on lending credit by jurisdictions to private entities is that cannot apply to banking. And the reason is that whether we have a public bank or not, we deposit money in banks, but those deposits are loans. The money is taken by the private banks and re-lent for profit. And they use our credit to do that. So I just want to put that idea.
I can understand, talking to people is sometimes difficult to get across. Is a deposit that a bank has isn't an asset; it's a liability. So you're not necessarily for the state to put a deposit in there, you're not necessarily at risk. But the legal advice that says, as soon as that gets transferred into that deposit gets transferred into a loan, that it could potentially be a violation of our Washington State Constitution. And so that's a lot of legislatures and a lot of legal theories interpret our prohibition on gift of public funds to be quite strict. And there has been some pushback that some of the interpretations are more strict than what is reasonable. And definitely, unfortunately, our courts really haven't been helpful because they've been kind of determined the terms of it in a kind of an ad hoc manner without really a systematic formula that you can apply for all sorts of situations. So we've really just kind of pieced together understanding this through various precedent over time. So, but your point is well taken because a lot of state constitutions have a prohibition of gift of public funds, but they just don't have it as the threshold as high as it seemed to be established here in Washington.
Thank you,
Same here.
We're going to continue the conversation, but this is the end of the formal show, so we're going to turn off the recording